Robopolis BG. Добре дошли в света на роботите за дома и офиса, градината и басейна. Богат избор на роботи за почистване на прозорци, самообслужващи се прахосмокачки роботи с моп, роботи-косачки и роботи за басейни. Всички модели са налични. Robopolis BG. Доверете се на опита.
Днес ви срещам с Бьорн Ломборг. Бьорн Ломборг е датски политолог, автор на книги, като последната му Best Things First беше определена от The Economist за една от най-добрите книги през 2023 година в Европа. Ломборг е президент на мозъчния тръст Copenhagen Consensus Center. Той е бивш директор на Института за оценка на околната среда на датското правителство в Копенхаген. Ломборг стана международно известен с фалшива аларма, като вътре в тези книги той оспорва апокалиптичните тези на климатичните активисти, които аз наричам затоплисти. Не казваме, че няма промяна в климата. Въпросът е колко е значима тя и дали е причинена от хората. Ломборг твърди, че те силно преувеличават проблема с климата, а политически елит е лицемерен и заявява, вярвате или не, животът на Земята се подобрява и има по-ефективни начини да решаваме проблемите си с по-малко пари. Идеята на Ломборг е да не влизат толкова средства за борба с климата, природата, както искате го наречете. Защото и той и аз предполагаме, че там някъде се краде.
Thank you, Bjorn. Really appreciate you being on here, and it was a lot of fun. I enjoyed it. Yes.
People all around the world, their lives are basically dependent on fossil fuels. And so the idea that we're going to get people off by making it so expensive that it becomes impossible for them to live good lives is almost morally reprehensible.
Thanks for listening to this conversation with Bjorn Lomborg.
I'm pleased to be here today live, so that's also good, with Bjorn Lomborg, who runs a think tank called Copenhagen Consensus.
Със своя мозъчен тръст, Копенхагенски консенсус, така се нарича тръстът, Ломборг работи за намирането на най-ефективни решения на най-големите предизвикателства в света, от болести и глад до климат и образование. Днес Бьорн Ломборг е наш гост. Мистер Бьорн Ломборг.
Yes.
I'm Martin Карбовски.
I'm
Hello.
just going to call you Martin, if that's okay.
Where are you now?
So I'm in southern Sweden.
Why do you think that climate change is not an existential threat?
So look, climate change is a problem, but we're being sold as if it's this end of the world, that this is the existential crisis, as you mentioned, and it's not. That's just not what the UN climate panel is telling us. A new OECD survey shows that 60% of everyone in the rich world believes that unless we address climate change dramatically, it's likely or very likely that this will lead to the end of mankind. That obviously scares people witless, that scares small children, but it's just not true. Climate change is a problem. This matters a lot because if we think it's the end of the world, we obviously think it's the only thing we should be concerned about. If we realize it's a problem, one among many problems that we need to fix, we can start having a rational discussion about, so what should we do? So if you will, imagine that a lot of the climate alarmists, a lot of the people who write the news, they will tell you something along the lines of, this is a meteor hurtling towards Earth as if it's going to eradicate all of humankind. A little bit like the meteor that eradicated the dinosaurs, right? If there was such a meteor hurtling towards Earth, it should be our only concern. It should be what we spent all our money on. But it's just not that. How big of a problem is it? What we actually know, because this is what climate economists have been spending the last 30 years on. So the world's most well-known climate economist, William Nordhaus, he is the only person to win the Nobel Prize in climate economics, and Richard Tull, one of the most quoted climate economists in the world. They have both done meta-studies where they've tried to look at what is the total impact of climate on human welfare. And the simple answer is it is somewhere, by the end of the century, it's somewhere between 2 and 3% of our income. It's going to feel a little bit like by the end of this century, we will be 2 to 3% less well off than we otherwise would have been. Now, that's not nothing, that's a problem. But remember, that is just not the end of the world. The UN estimate that by the end of the century, the average person on the planet will be 450% as rich as he or she is today. That's a fantastic achievement. But because of climate change, it's going to feel like he or she is only 435 to 440% as rich. Yes, that's slightly less well off, but it's still fantastically much better. It's just not a climate catastrophe or an ecological disaster. It's a problem. And that's why I'm saying we're being sold a story that this is the end of the world. No, there is a problem, but we need to get this right.
You criticize mainstream theories of ecological crisis. Can we summarize your criticism? You have these books, False Alarm and Skeptical Environmentalist.
So it's all kinds of stories. So whenever you see a hurricane, you're being told, see, climate change. But it's not like there wasn't hurricanes before. Actually, right now, we cannot show that there are more hurricanes or stronger hurricanes. Eventually, it will probably be such that there will be fewer hurricanes, which is good, but stronger hurricanes, which is bad. But we just can't see that right now. Likewise, whenever you hear about fire in the world, you know, the recent fires in Los Angeles, everyone says, see, climate change. But the reality is that over the last 25 years, when we have had satellite coverage of the world, fire, the amount of fire, the area of land burned by fire has dropped about 25%. It is not burning more, it's actually burning less. And so what we're really up against is there is a real problem with climate. But because every single thing, every single bad thing is being named as climate change, you get this scare sense that everybody's told everything you see is climate. And that's just not correct. You need to look at the data. There's a great sort of example of this from the US. If you look over the last 30 years, crime in the US has dropped dramatically on all accounts, both violent and nonviolent, and theft and everything else. According to the official statistics, we've seen a dramatic decline in crime. But if you ask most people in the US, they will tell you there's more and more crime. And the reason, of course, is that's because we got CNN and all the other 24/7 news channels that are broadcasting one crime after another. So you see a lot more about it on TV, but there's actually less crime. And it's a little bit the same thing we see with climate. You see all this stuff on TV. You constantly see, here's an extra hurricane, here is another place where it's burning, but it's not the right way to understand it. You actually have to look at the data. And that's what I do. I'm a statistician. I try to show what does the data actually tell us. So fire down, hurricanes about the same. Let me just give you one more example. On heat and cold deaths. So we often hear that there are going to be more heat waves because of climate change. That's absolutely true. And so we also estimate over the last 2 decades, we have seen, because temperatures have gone up, we have seen more heat waves and hence more people dying from heat. A new Lancet study indicates that this is 116,000 more people that die every year because of more heat. That is a real issue. But what you never hear is many, many more people almost everywhere on the planet die from cold than die from heat. And as temperatures go up, you get fewer cold waves. And so you also need to be told how many fewer people die from cold. It turns out that globally over the last 2 decades, 283,000 fewer people die each year from cold. So overall, we actually have fewer people dying, about 166,000 people dying more people dying from heat, but many fewer people dying from cold. Again, you're not well served if you only hear the scary part, but don't hear the non-scary part. That's basically what I try to do. Let's hear the full story, not just the scary one.
We need this conversation here in Bulgaria, but explain us what are the false things that climate activists and politicians are trying to convince us.
So I think there's a lot of wrong things that we're being told. Obviously, some of these things we just talked about with that there are more hurricanes, that every hurricane you see or every fire or heat and cold deaths. But we're also being told that we need to change our entire energy system away from fossil fuels towards green energy. Now, it's true, if you want to fix climate change, you need to do that. But what we're very often told is, oh, and it's going to make lots of green jobs and it's going to be cheap. It's actually going to be cheaper than what you currently have, which would be great. But then we wouldn't need to have a big discussion about it. Then everybody would just do it automatically. But the reality is, this is going to be phenomenally costly. And so I think the real problem here is there's an unwillingness both to tell the truth when it comes to what are the facts about all the climate impacts, that there are both positives and negatives, that there are more people dying from heat, but fewer people dying from cold, but also an insistence that this is going to be cheap. And that's just not true. I did a plot of all the countries that we have good data for, how much do you pay for electricity? And then I correlated it with how much of your electricity do you get from solar and wind. And, the way you hear it, the more solar and wind, because remember, solar and wind is incredibly cheap. You should get cheaper and cheaper electricity, but no, that's not how it goes. The more solar and wind you get, the more costly electricity becomes. There are no countries in the world that have lots of solar and wind and cheap electricity. There are lots of countries that have lots of solar and wind and very, very high prices. So my native country, Denmark, is actually the world's leading country. It has lots of wind power, especially. About 60% of its electricity comes from wind, but it also has some of the most expensive electricity in the world. And you got to ask yourself, how is that possible? Because as everyone tells you, as solar and wind have become more plentiful, they have dropped in price dramatically. But the problem is you and I and everybody else don't just want to have electricity when the sun is shining or the wind is blowing. We want it 24/7. Yeah. And when the sun is not shining or the wind is not blowing, these energy sources are infinitely costly. You can't buy them. So the reality is you have to both pay for solar and wind, and then you have to pay for all the backup system for when it's not shining and windy. And that's why you end up, in essence, not totally, but almost pay for two energy systems. And not surprisingly, that's a lot more expensive than paying for one. That, I think, is probably the biggest problem in the whole climate conversation, that we're being told this is going to be incredibly cheap. But the truth is, no, this is going to be incredibly expensive.
But some people trying to convince us, ride a bike. I have a plane, private plane, but you must ride a bike. What is this?
So it's fine to ride a bike. And by all means, do that when you can. But don't pretend that this is what's going to fix the planet. The reality is that good lives come with lots and lots of energy usage. So if you look at poor countries, they universally have very little energy. So remember, the average person in sub-Saharan Africa, so in the poor part of Africa, has less electricity for his entire life and for all the business and industry that's correlated with that than what your or my refrigerator uses in a year. There's simply very, very little energy and hence very little income. Rich countries, that be Bulgaria or the rest of Europe or the US or Australia, have lots of energy and have very high incomes. This is how you get well off, by having lots of energy. So this is not about us getting on a bike instead of a car. It is eventually to having a car that doesn't emit CO2. It's about eventually having energy that doesn't emit CO2. That's great as an idea. But right now, we have to be honest and say doing so is going to be very, very expensive. And that's, of course, why most people will not elect governments that keep pushing for more and more costly affairs. A good example, for instance, is Britain. Great Britain has been the leader in trying to cut carbon emissions, and they have succeeded to quite an extent. They have really cut their carbon emissions. They have stopped all their coal-fired power plants. But the problem is also that their energy prices have shot through the roof and have basically made it very hard, if you're poor, to have access to a lot of energy. So the reality is, over the last 3 decades, from 2003 to 2023, electricity prices in the UK have tripled. They've become 3 times as great, whereas in the US, in the same period, they have almost not budged. So there are real costs to climate policy. And these costs now translate in, just when you look at the electricity, into 2% of Great Britain's GDP, or the equivalent of twice as much as what they spend on primary schooling now in the UK. These are real costs, and these are costs mostly borne by the poorer people in Great Britain. Of course, rich people can just get away with paying for it, but poor people will actually have to turn off. And, we also see that in a lot of statistics. A lot of poor pensioners, for instance, will only have part of their home heated through the winter, and they will have heated to too low a temperature, so they're actually freezing a little bit. They put on lots of coats and stuff. That's not how an industrialized society should be. That's not how a rich country should be. And so again, we need to say, yes, there's a problem with climate change. It's a 2 to 3% problem, as we talked about. If you can solve this for 1%, that's great. Yeah. It's not a good idea to solve a little bit for 10%, which unfortunately is what Britain and many others in the EU are now proposing.
Give me your opinion for electric cars.
They have been pushed as this amazing silver bullet that's going to fix a lot of climate change. First of all, electric cars still take a lot of energy to produce, especially the battery, which is often produced in China with coal. So most electric cars have already emitted a lot more CO2 when you buy them. Now, when you use them, you will emit less CO2. So we believe that if you actually use the car as much as you would a normal gasoline car, you will probably only emit about half as much CO2. That's nice. That's perhaps 22 tons of CO2 over the car's lifetime, or a value. You could buy this on the US, on the longest running US carbon exchange for about $500 or 500 euros. So that's nice. But remember, most governments have to give subsidies in the order of 5,000 euros, which is much, much more, which is really a waste of resources. But beyond that, most people don't drive their electric cars nearly as far as they drive their real gasoline-driven cars, because most people buy the electric cars as a secondary vehicle, the one that you drive down to the supermarket or drive into town, also to show off how good a person you are. But if you're actually going anywhere for real, you will take your gasoline-driven car. Moreover, because most of these cars are 300 to 400 kilograms heavier, they also pollute more. Now, this is surprising because many people think that electric cars are absolutely clean. They're totally clean in their emissions, but because they weigh much more, they both wear out the road surface much more. They're essentially like having a lot of really heavy cars on there, but they also wear out the tires, and that generates a lot of air pollution. The newest meta study from this year suggests that they actually pollute more overall because of all that extra wear from the tires and from the brakes. So the reality is they're not clean. They're actually and probably more polluting. And then you also have to remember that electric cars, because they're much more heavy, will damage more people in traffic. Remember, having a really heavy car is great for you in traffic, but it's terrible for the other guy. If you drive a tank, you will survive anything, right? But the other people won't. And what we're essentially doing with electric cars is we're making everybody a little more like a tank, which is great for the guys inside the electric car, but which actually kills more people outside. So a Nature study a couple of years ago estimated that it's likely that the death toll from heavier electric cars will totally outweigh the climate benefit. So the short version of your question, so what do you think about electric cars? They're a nice thing to drive. They'll work for some people, but let's not at all pretend that they're this silver bullet. It's likely that in their current form, they're just not all that much worth, which of course is why you have to bribe people a lot of money to get them to drive them. But moreover, even if we get it right, it's only ever going to be some bits of society that are going to drive the electric car. Remember, if you own a house, you have a place where you can recharge your car. If you live in an apartment, where are you going to recharge your car? This is the kind of thing that's so obviously thought up by rich people who all own their own houses and think, oh, that's easy. But, depending on the country, this is 40 to 60% of the population who can't just do this. So again, it's a little bit of the solution, but not a lot. Just to give you one statistic to finish off, we're all being told that electric cars are going to be dominating, in a decade or two. Biden, just before he resigned, actually had his Energy Information Administration make their latest estimate of how many electric cars are going to be on the road in 2050. The answer? 24% of the global car park in 2050 will be electric cars. 66% will still be fossil fuel-driven cars. Now, obviously, this is a prediction, but it does tell you that these stories you hear that this is going to be the solution for the whole world, probably not true.
What do you think for Europe, for European Union? Europe aims after 30 years, 25 years, to be the first climate neutral continent in the world. What exactly mean this? For the ordinary people here in Bulgaria, is it realistic? And what mean for me? What that mean neutral, climate neutral Bulgarian guy?
Everything is possible if you spend enough money. That's sort of the economist's take on this. So going net zero basically means we're going to stop using fossil fuels or use very little fossil fuels in the European Union. We're also going to stop using a lot of other things. So remember, fossil fuels is not just your energy, but it's the fertilizer that makes it possible for you to be fed. It's the cement that you put into pretty much all your buildings. It's the plastics that make it possible for us to have medical industry and a lot of other benefits around the world. It's all the chemical industries. So the reality is this is going to be phenomenally expensive. Remember, right now, the European Union spends more than 360 billion euros per year just buying solar panels, wind turbines, electric cars, chargers, power stations, all these things, just to go to net zero. This is going to escalate dramatically. It's going to be a very large part of our spending. It is not unreasonable to expect. So one estimate shows that going net zero for Europe is going to cost us about 10%, 10.5% of our GDP. So that means every 10th kroner or dollar or euro or whatever will now have to go to the net zero spending. That means you will be 10% less well off. It will mean that there are a lot of things that you can't afford as much as you otherwise would be able to. But it also means there's a lot of prices that are going to skyrocket and very likely lead you to vote for a politician that will say, I don't want to do this. Remember, we have to do this for 25 years. We're not going to be willing to keep voting for politicians who do that. We're eventually going to say, no, enough is enough. And, eventually, if they keep on, people will start voting for candidates like Trump. Not that I'm saying that's a great solution, but I'm simply pointing out you can't keep piling more and more costs on people. Now, if Europe was then solve climate change, maybe all this pain would be worth it. But it won't. Not at all. So if you take the European Union's emissions and look at what will happen if we go net zero by 2050 and stay that way. So we'll be paying 10% of our GDP. We will be paying, in the order of 3.3 trillion euros per year by mid-century for the privilege of doing this. If you put that into the UN climate model, the equivalent impact in temperature is 0 today. Of course, it'll have no impact today. By 2050, the reduction in global temperature will be a minuscule 0.02 degrees. We will just not be able to see it. Even in 2100, so in 75 years from now, by the end of the century, the reduction will be 0.08 degrees temperature. So we would basically be paying more than 100 trillion euros, probably much more than that, in the EU collectively over the century. And even our great-grandkids will not be able to tell the difference in 100 years. That's just a terrible use of resources. And this, again, is the reason why I say we need to understand climate is a problem, yes. But unfortunately, it's a problem that we right now can only very expensively do very little to fix. And so maybe we should start being smarter about this. And that's, of course, one of the main points that I've been trying to say. Instead of doing the stupid policies that we're doing right now, which makes you feel all good but doesn't actually work, we should be focusing on much smarter, much more effective, and much cheaper solutions that would actually help.
What do you think about the European green politics? They're crazy people, I think. We think here in Bulgaria, a little bit crazy or very crazy.
They are very privileged and they're very focused on this one thing. Remember, so I once talked to a guy who was a biologist. He studied frogs. He obviously thought frogs was the most important thing in the world. I get that. If that's your thing, then obviously that's important. As you can tell, I like plants. Obviously, plants are important to me. But we got to have a sense of proportion on this. And I think this is where the Greens have sort of taken over this moral grandstanding and this moral high ground of saying, oh, you don't want to help the planet? You don't want to save the planet? And obviously, this is dependent on what we started off the conversation with. If this was the end of the world, if this was a meteor hurtling towards Earth, this should be our only concern. And then they would be right. We should be spending all of our money here because otherwise everybody's going to be dead in 100 years. It's just not the true story. This is a smaller problem by the end of the century that unfortunately a lot of the Greens are wanting to spend an inordinate amount of money on. And that's just a bad idea. So I don't think, I know a lot of these people. I think they're well-intentioned. Just like many other well-intentioned people have led a lot of nations and histories astray. I think they have good intentions, but their solutions are hopeless. So if you don't mind, I'd love to tell you. Okay, yes, please.
I think they're crooks.
Yes. Well, okay, and that's a fair interpretation. Some of them certainly are because they also make a lot of money from all of these. So remember, a lot of the green companies that may stand to gain billions will obviously tell you, yes, you should be doing more of this. Buy my product. So I get that there's a lot of self-servingness in this, but I think most of the people who have been very sort of, on the front run of this, They do actually want to do good, but they're just focused on this one thing. And if you're focused on climate change, then clearly electric cars and expensive solar panels are the right way forward. But if you're actually focused on making humanity better off, there are many other and smarter ways to do so.
You focus on 12 smartest things we can do. Explain these 12 smartest things.
Brilliant. I will first just tell you what are the smart things to do in climate, and then I will get to the book and talk about all the other things. So on climate, first of all, I think we have to do four things. We have to tell people the way it is. So not scare people witless, but actually tell them this is a problem. It's one of many problems. Then we need to invest a lot more in energy research and development. The simple answer is we're never going to solve climate change by telling everyone, I'm sorry, would you mind being poorer, colder, less comfortable, not be able to eat as much meat, and no, you can't drive and you certainly can't fly, and we could do that in the next 30 years, and we're going to try to get everybody on board. That's just never going to work. What has always worked is innovation. If you think about Los Angeles in the 1950s, Los Angeles in the 1950s was a terribly polluted place, mostly because of cars. And they have a very special geographic situation that makes all of the air pollution sort of stick in Los Angeles. The climate alarmist sort of solution to Los Angeles would be to tell everyone, would you mind to walk instead? Which, of course, would never work in Los Angeles. But the right solution was the innovation of the catalytic converter. This little gizmo you put on the tailpipe of the car, and it cleans most of the air. And now Los Angeles is much, much cleaner. The simple point here is technology is going to be the solution. If we could innovate green energy that's cheaper than fossil fuels, we'd be done. Everyone would switch, not just rich, well-meaning Europeans, but also the Chinese, the Indians, and the Africans. And so what I'm saying is the second solution has to be innovation. Then we also have to focus on adaptation. So again, remember, if you worry about more heat waves, one way to fix this would be to fix climate change. But that turns out to be incredibly costly and very, very slow. So if you actually want people to survive heat waves, maybe you should give them air conditioning. This is not rocket science. It's a very simple thing. So back in 2003, Europe had this huge heat wave that killed possibly somewhere between 75 and 150,000 people in Europe. That was a big scandal. A lot of people said, oh, we need to do more climate policies. But of course, that would never work for future people. It would simply mean that slightly fewer, many more would die. The real solution, which was also what a lot of technocrats did, was we got, for instance, air conditioning in old people's homes in France. And so in 2015, when there was an even stronger heat wave, many fewer people died because now they actually had air conditioning. This is not rocket science. We need to be smart about this. And then the fourth thing, and this is important, and especially perhaps for Bulgaria, we need to focus on getting economic growth. Because remember, a lot of the things that are going to protect us against climate change and protect us against Russia and protect us against AI and protect us against a lot of other things in the world is the fact that if you're well off, you have a lot of resources to deal with this. If you're poor, you're screwed. And so we really need to make sure that we get better off, that we have more resources, not just so that we can protect ourselves better against heat waves and hurricanes and all these other things, but that we can also get our kids better education and we can get more healthcare and we can get better infrastructure and all the other things that matter for a great life. So my four solutions for climate is tell it as it is, innovation, adaptation, and get rich. This is not rocket science, but it's incredibly much cheaper than the current green solutions, and it's also going to be a lot more effective. But of course, as you also point out, it will be less good for the crooks.
But when you get rich, you hurt the nature. This is a philosophy here.
A lot of people think so, but if you actually look at the evidence, it is poor people that hurt the environment most. You cut down rainforest if you're poor in Brazil or if you're poor in Congo. But when you're rich, you start reforesting because you want more environment. Likewise, when you're poor, there's lots of air pollution. When you become rich, you enact policies, you buy more expensive products, and so you actually end up being cleaner. We know almost universally that it's rich nations that are clean and poor nations that are dirty. Indira Gandhi actually said it very well when she said, the biggest pollutant is poverty. And so I think, we really need to understand that, yes, not all problems are solved with wealth. And there are some issues. We obviously consume more. And so you have to be more careful and more consistent about how you deal with, for instance, refuse. But it's really something that rich countries deal with. And I think the EU is a great example of that. The EU, because we're rich, is so incredibly environmentally focused. And they can afford to, in a certain sense. But we really need to have an understanding you need to be rich in order to care about the environment, not the other way around. Likewise, with education. So pretty much everywhere, education sucks. I mean, even in rich countries, but it sucks terribly in poor countries.
Yeah.
And we know very, very simple approaches that could make a huge difference. So take a poor school in, say, Africa or in Southeast Asia. We know that more than 380 million kids are going to, right now, in primary school, will never get to learn to read and write at a level of comprehension. They sort of know the alphabet. They can sort of spell their way through a sentence, but they don't actually understand what's happening. And they, of course, cannot participate in a 21st century economy. We know how to help this. So let me give you one example. If you put in tablets with educational software and get the kids in front of this 1 hour a day, this tablet will very quickly catch on and where exactly are you at and teach you at your level. That way you can teach everyone in the class at their exact level. And it turns out if you do this 1 hour a day, so 7 hours, they will still go to school and learn almost nothing, but 1 hour a day, they'll actually learn a lot. Do that for a year, and it will cost 31 euros per kid per year. But the benefit is that these kids will become so much smarter that it's as if they went to school for 3 years. We've just tripled the efficiency of school for very little money. The net effect is that they're going to make another 20,000 euros over their lifetime because they'll be smarter. All right, much of this is far, far down the road, so the value now is about 2,000 euros. But spending 31 euros to do 2,000 euros of good is just simply a fantastic achievement. We could make the entire poor part of the world more than 600 billion euros better off each and every year through these very simple policies. This would cost about 10 billion euros. Why don't we do that? So again, my point here is to say that there's a lot of different problems that we, for very little money, could make an amazing achievement with. There's 12 all in all. So this is, immunization, it's chronic diseases, it's maternal and newborn health, it's land tenure reform, it's agricultural research and development. I've told you about some of these, but overall, it would cost very little money and would do an amazing amount of good. That's why I'm saying, whatever else it is that we're doing, this is what we should be doing first.
But you're not in Bulgaria. We have here Bulgarian problems. Europe wants to force Bulgaria to close our coal-fired power plants and use green energy. You know this problem? The name of the place is Maritsa 1 and Maritsa 2. This will have a catastrophic impact on our economy and energy independence. What would you recommend to Bulgaria in this case?